I think people underestimate how much leverage we can have here.
This is Riaz Hassan, the data scientist that we geeked out with, showing us the statistical impact of the Muslim vote in the upcoming general election.
The candidate themselves are not the most important thing here. What's more important is the impact and the confidence it gives our community, I think.
Yeah, we dig into some juicy spreadsheets in this episode of Empowered by Islam 21C, our new weekly podcast where we collaborate with leading voices to discuss Islam's solutions to 21st century challenges and trends. Why don't you start off by telling us a bit about yourself? Who are you and what have you been up to?
Yeah, sure. So I don't want to go into too much detail at the moment, but I think suffices to say that we've been working on some of the data aspects behind the voting initiative for the Muslim vote, and looking at a number of constituencies and a basic plan of how to address this issue, knowing that the elections were forthcoming. So that's what we've been working on for the past few months. And now that we're in the thick of it, we've also been looking at some of the more tactical issues around different constituencies.
I wanted to get, in this podcast and get kind of stuck into some of the stats, So feel free to geek out, get elbow deep in some stats here. So let me just ask, how many constituencies do you think the Muslim vote actually has a significant sway in? And how do you go about
Well,
calculating that?
I think if we step back a bit here, I think the way to look at this is to understand, what is the criteria that we need to use in terms of determining what the success factor will be for which constituencies to really concentrate on and which constituencies not to concentrate on. So initially, when people started off this exercise, there was a view that, looking at constituencies with a slim majority, let's say for Labour or the Tories, would be a viable indicator of whether that seat can be turned or not. But in my view, I think that's perhaps the wrong way to look at things. And I've hopefully managed to convince a few people that it is the wrong way to look at things. I think the main success factor or criteria to look at when looking at the potential success of a constituency is the concentration of the Muslim majority in that constituency. So despite a constituency having a massive majority for Labour, let's say Tower Hamlets, for example, or one of the Birmingham constituencies, for example, that doesn't mean that constituency cannot be turned, right? Similarly, if a constituency has a very small majority for one party or the other, but it doesn't have a big concentration of Muslims, then it's sometimes very difficult to turn that constituency around. So I think it's important that people understand, how to view the criteria by which to apply, and that's quite different. And we're lucky in the UK because in the UK we have very concentrated pockets of Muslim populations that can easily be used and leveraged to create this kind of phenomena that we've got going now in terms of people standing up for elections. So I would say that's the way to look at it. And just further to your point, I think there's probably about 20 constituencies where either we have a real chance today or we can probably have a real chance moving forward. So that's kind of where we are and what we've applied.
And that's just the Muslims, right? But there are how many more constituencies are there? Would you say that there is a potential for Muslims and people who have similar overlapping interests and values and so forth, for them to make a difference in this election?
So I think that would increase the number of constituencies slightly, maybe to about 30. But I think, again, there are a number of variable factors involved in those constituencies. So, for example, it could be because of certain other factors and criteria that come into those constituencies. So an example would be somewhere like Oxford East, I think I was looking at with a few people, whereby some of the local issues tend to transcend some of the more wider issues that people are looking at. And although that may be on the border, there are other factors that come into play in terms of measuring out how successful we are or not in that constituency. So yeah, there are those. But primarily, I think in this election cycle, we have to really look at how can we leverage our views on Gaza, our views against the Labour Party, our views against the Tory Party in that manner. And that comes down to where there's a high concentration of Muslims, fundamentally.
Yeah, you've made headlines of the Muslim vote for the last few months, with the local council elections. There was a furore about kind of Muslim takeover kind of tropes
Mm.
with a few constituencies. I was reading the other day in the Jewish Chronicle, a senior Labour Party source said that they have quote unquote deep concern over the impact of the Muslim vote campaigning in the election. So we are, as a community, making ruffling a few feathers. But I
Yeah.
wanted to get your advice or your take on how to go about looking at certain constituencies. Like
Yeah.
just
Sure.
imagine maybe if we can look at a handful of constituencies, someone sitting there, wondering is it worth it, or
Yeah.
because we still have this apathy or this sense of woe is me, the system is against us, and blah blah blah.
Mm.
But, we do want to see that and give some concrete examples of, look, the statistics say there's this many of you, and this is what you need to win an election or swing an election, and this is what the stats say. So what have you got for us?
Yeah. Sure. So I think just on that last point that you made about Labour being worried about certain constituencies. Well, actually, that's kind of a feather in our cap, really, because the
Mm,
constituencies that we identified beforehand are the same ones that they're worried about. So it kind of tallies that, we're somewhere on the right track with this kind of philosophy in terms of looking at things.
yeah.
So what I want to indicate here, and before I go to some of the geeky stuff, the number stuff, which by the way I feel a bit of an imposter syndrome because I got some other people to run these numbers for me, people who are a lot younger and can code a lot better than I can, right? So, but yes, I'll present it. But before we go to the numbers, I think it's important to understand that identifying those constituencies is one thing, and understanding the measure behind why we're looking at certain things and why we're not looking at other things is really important. So I'll start off by looking at and I'll make no apologies for this because that's where I live and I've been working on the local campaign here in Luton, right? So
Hmm.
Luton is a very good example of what I mean, because it's a very highly concentrated Muslim town where the percentage of the Muslim population here is about approaching 30%, right? And
Inshallah.
traditionally, they've all voted Labour. So this has been a safe Labour seat for, many, many election cycles. There's a Labour majority of about 10,000, and it's rarely changed. The Muslim vote has always been in this town for Labour. But when you go out onto the doorstep nowadays, and when we've been canvassing as we have been intensely for the last few weeks, the call on the doorstep is very much that we've always voted Labour, but we're not going to vote Labour this time, right? So there's a jump there from being a guaranteed Labour vote to absolutely no vote for Labour. In fact,
Mm.
I haven't come across hardly any instances where Muslims have said that they will keep their Labour vote, right?
Wow,
So
mashallah.
that's one thing, and I think what our challenge is to make them understand that there is an alternative and that it's a viable alternative. So it's not some sort of pipe dream, and it's not some sort of vanity project, really, either.
Mm.
So
Mm.
I think that's the way people have got to understand it, and there's a real chance of winning, especially in this seat and other seats. So let me just try and share my screen with you. Okay, so this is a template or a model for how we've used to measure the success viability of a particular constituency. So I'm looking at Luton South at the moment, right? So this is this is the results of the 2019 elections, whereby Labour had about 21,000 votes in Luton South, followed by the Tories. So they had an overall majority of about 9,000, right?
Mhm.
So what we've tried to do here is build in other factors. So, for example, the way the opinion polls stand today, where there's a massive swing towards Labour of about 20 points at the moment, right? So
Mhm.
we've tried to build that in, and the reduction in the Tory vote, to make people understand that if the election was held today and if there was no other candidates, what the result would be. So in
Mhm.
that case, the result would be an increased majority for Labour of about 15,000, right? If you can see the cell
Mhm.
that I've
Yeah.
highlighted there. And then there's other complications to do with boundary changes, which a lot of constituencies are experiencing. So we've tried to build in those factors as well to make it as real as possible, right?
Mhm.
So I won't go through all of these numbers here, just for the sake of sanity here, right? I think rather than bore everyone to death with all the different aspects of this, but I think the fundamental thing to understand is this figure here. So if we had an independent candidate, we need to understand. I'll just highlight this figure here. So
Yeah.
if we had an independent candidate, what kind of swing would it need for that independent candidate to creep past the Labour vote and achieve success, right? So, one of the assumptions, and one of the more pertinent assumptions here, is that the candidate would have to extract uh, as much of the Labour vote as possible, the existing Labour vote, right? So, that's what
Mm.
we're basing it on, because it's very difficult for an independent candidate on a pro Gaza ticket, for example, to extract votes from the Tory party or from any other party, right? Most of those votes are going to come from people who are predisposed to the issue in Gaza and would vote
Yeah.
for an independent. So this is the target for success, if you like, which is about 14,900 votes, or about 15,000 votes. And for that to happen, you would need to extract about 48% of that Labour vote coming through, right?
Where does
So
that 48% come from?
yeah, so that's 48% of the people who previously voted Labour and would need to change, right, in order
Hmm.
to achieve victory.
Oh, so that's
Now,
the minimum required for Labour.
yeah, exactly. Now, if you bear that victory target in mind, which is about 14,900, one of the core things to understand is that how many votes are available to you to make that happen, right? So here you're looking at dividing your demographics into different aspects. So one of the more fundamental demographics that we have to look at, and the reason why I talked about the concentration of Muslim electorate in a constituency, is because those are the people, as I've just previously expressed, on the doorstep that are more willing
Mm.
to change. They just don't know who to change for at the moment, right? And that's our challenge. And if you look at that, you can understand that, Luton South has the figures that I'm highlighting here, has about 25,000 Muslim electorate, which is about roughly short of about 27%
So
of
that's
the total
electorate. So
population.
that's people over 18 who are eligible to vote.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah.
Mm.
But that's 25,000 people, but not all of those people are going to vote, for the sake of the independent candidate, for example, right?
Hmm.
And the reason for that is because turnout figures in elections are around between 60 to 70%. In Luton, they're about 60, 62%, something like that.
Hmm.
Now, so that is always going to occur. You're always going to have a fundamental part of that electorate that are just not going to bother to vote, right? So
Mm.
you build that in. So you can't kind of assume that all 25,000 will come and vote for you. So taking that into consideration, and then from the people that actually turn out to vote, you can't expect that all of them, 100% of them, will vote for an independent candidate, no matter how much canvassing you do, no matter how much convincing you do. There will still be some old guard Muslim population or other populations that will continue to vote
Yeah.
as they have done previously. So, giving it a realistic target of, let's say, about 68%, which is the cell I'm highlighting now, of people who actually turn out that may potentially vote in line with the independent candidate, what that then gives you is the Muslim ceiling of the Muslim vote, right? Which is realistically how many Muslims would vote in line with an independent candidate, right?
Hmm.
Is that making sense so far?
And that's how many then?
So that figure comes out to be this figure here, which is about
11,000.
11,980, which is
Okay.
about 12,000
Hmm.
people.
Hmm.
So if you compare that to, for example, the figure that's needed for victory, which is about 15,000, you
Yeah.
have a shortfall about 2,900. Yeah.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So now you need to achieve victory, you need to get that 2,900 extra votes somehow. Yeah. Now
Mm.
that can you can do there's two options to getting that. One option is that you go into the wider community and you try and convince other people, which is I think a very viable option to do.
Mm.
But in a short election cycle like we have now, since Rishi Sunak announced the elections, it's about 4, 5, 6 weeks, right?
Yeah.
That aspect is a little bit more difficult to do in that short time span. So one of the other ways of achieving that is to increase the turnout of the Muslim vote in that constituency,
Hmm.
right? From 60% to, let's say, 65% or something like that. If we were to do that, then actually you can achieve victory in the same manner, right?
Hmm.
And you can achieve that victory target of about 14,000. And that's the way I think we need to approach this problem, and understand how what is the route to victory and how do we get there.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
if that's making
Excellent.
sense.
Mashallah. Mashallah.
Um,
So that's Luton South.
yeah, and just one of the other things to consider here is the fact that the demographics of the Muslim population have changed, right? So whereas the younger demographics, by young I mean people under 35, a lot of them are at voting age now. So
Yeah.
the ceiling of people under 35 is actually this figure here, which is about, if you can see that figure there, which is about nearly 6,000 votes. So
Wow.
6,000 of those 12,000 votes would actually come from people under the age of 35. Yeah, if that
Mashallah.
makes sense. So that's the way we've got to look at the issue. And I think Luton South in particular is a very promising seat for us,
Yeah.
in terms of understanding what the dynamics are and how that can be achieved. And I'm going to say that, but I would,
No,
I'd
no
probably go,
ta'assub there.
sorry?
No asabiya there. No, no tribalism.
No tribalism, no, no. I'm from Luton North anyway, right? So that's
Okay.
full stop.
Oh, we hate Luton
Um,
South.
yeah, I hate Luton South. Yeah, but the thing is here, it's I really seriously think is this podcast going to go out? I'm not sure if it's going to go out before July the 4th or July
No,
the
well,
5th.
inshallah, we're trying to. We want to try
Right.
and get
So
use this to encourage
I'm
people
going to
to
make
vote.
a prescient view here that we have a very high chance of victory here in this
Mm,
constituency. So let's see how that pans out. And even in Luton North,
so,
which is very similar, it's not not quite as promising as this, but not far behind either. So that's kind of how we stack up, right?
mashallah.
Um, One of the other ones I really wanted to show you was Dewsbury. So this is Dewsbury, right? So it's exactly the same template with the figures for basically Dewsbury.
Okay.
Now, the interesting thing here is if you look at those two columns that I was talking about here, which is the victory target, which is about 12,500 roughly. But if you look at the projected Muslim ceiling of the Muslim vote in Dewsbury, that's actually exceeds the victory target,
Oh, mashallah.
right? So that's about 14,000, which means that you've almost got another 2,000 votes to spare, which means that statistically, in all the country, Dewsbury is perhaps one of the most promising seats that we can, place candidates in,
Wow,
to achieve victory. Yeah,
mashallah.
if that
Is
makes
that
sense.
taking
So
into account the voter turnout percentage?
yes, it's taking into account the voter turnout percentage, which is about 69% in
Okay,
Dewsbury.
so it's actually more
It's
than.
taking into account also the Labour advantage as well, which is the Labour swing from Tory to Labour as well. And it's also taking into account the high concentration of Muslims in Dewsbury and Batley, which is actually a new seat, you
Mm,
know. So, in that respect, I think we've got to look at these seats with a very fundamental view of how really viable they are. So this is not just a vanity project. This is something that is really, really achievable, even in this
yeah.
election cycle. I think the thing that counts most towards this is the actual turnout. So in the next few weeks, what I would say to people is that the turnout is the most important thing. So if you don't turn
Mm,
out, then we're not going to achieve this victory, right?
mhm,
If
mhm,
people do turn out and vote for the independent candidates in these constituencies, then this is very, very much possible.
mm. Do we have any stats? I know I'm imagining how hard this is to actually verify properly, but do we have any estimates of Muslim voter turnout?
So Muslim vote, I mean, turnout in general across most constituencies varies from about 59% to about 72%, roughly speaking, or
Mhm.
75%. In the more affluent constituencies, it's about 75%. So that's roughly what it is. In some of the more Muslim constituencies, is at the very lower end of that figure. So, for example, in Birmingham or in Bradford or in some of the other more concentrated areas, it's roughly around 60%, I would say,
Mm,
60 to 62%. And that's kind of correlates well to a general Muslim turnout figure, I think, across the board. Yeah.
okay,
Um, uh, Obviously, there are demographics here. The more affluent the area is, the higher the turnout would be. But generally speaking, in some of the more concentrated areas, it's about
okay.
62,
I would
63%.
imagine, just anecdotally, the younger people are more likely to vote. Would you say that's true? More
Yes
politically
and no.
engaged.
Yes and no,
Hmm.
actually. I would say before the issue of Gaza, before
Mm,
October the 7th, young people, let's say from 18 to 25, would be perhaps more apathetic and not vote.
Mm, mm,
Right?
mm.
After the issue of Gaza has happened, I think it's changed slightly, but perhaps not to the extent that maybe I would have wanted it to change.
Yeah,
So we're still fighting that battle with the youth for them to register, for them to turn out, because the early part of this election cycle was really about getting people that are on your side to register to vote. There was a lot of work that
yeah,
went on in terms of trying to understand who those people were that weren't registered, firstly. So, again, the geeks that sit behind some of this stuff, right, ran some interesting programs in terms of looking at electoral rolls, finding out who's registered, and then finding out, from there who wasn't registered, right? Almost, if you like, and then approaching those people with mail shots or visits or whatever, and
mm,
get those
mm.
people to register before they leave.
TikTok.
Yeah, yeah, TikTok, and well, it was more understanding how those households to get, target those households specifically.
Mm,
um, and a lot of people, under the age of 25, maybe, should have registered. A lot of them did, but maybe we've missed some as well.
yeah,
That we need
yeah,
to address in future election cycles, I think. So that was a very important aspect of this, and that goes towards getting that higher turnout.
brilliant,
Yeah.
brilliant.
So the young vote is very, very important, and it's changed since October 7th. I think is more
Mm,
of a feeling of, when people went out to those marches. It's this election cycle and the work that's been done for campaigning for the independent candidates up and down the country is really an extension. What I say to people, of those marches that happened over the winter.
yeah,
So people felt that they needed to do something, and they needed to do something apart from just, pass around posts, interesting posts about, what happened and various theories. And they actually went out physically to those marches, and this is a prime extension of that feeling. So this is why we need a lot of our community really to turn out in large numbers.
yeah, yeah. So what else have you got to show us? Any other
uh,
juicy stats?
what Well, what I can show you is, for example, so I'm just going to whiz through it quickly so you can't see who's who here. But basically, this is a spreadsheet that, again, a number of the people who sit behind this, right? People who are
Hmm.
much younger and much more cleverer than me, who can actually work out matches of the electoral roll households to whether they're Muslim names or not. So they
Oh,
use
okay.
a almost like a Muslim names. Um, Database of about 2,000, 2,500 common
Nice.
Muslim names, and then they match them against the electoral roll, which everyone has access to, really.
Mm,
Anyone who's a candidate has access to. And then what you can do there is you can say, well, what is the probability that this household is a Muslim household, for example?
yeah,
And then you know how to target people. Because as we've gone on through the campaign, one of the things that we've discovered, I think in Luton, but also in many other places, is the fact that, we simply don't have enough people on the ground to campaign, right?
yeah,
One of the reasons for that is there's a little bit of an apathy in the Muslim community to do the actual door knocking and canvassing. And that's because people are not used to doing that kind of work, right? So that's why we really need people to come out and do this work. And therefore, you can't cover physically sometimes the whole area. So, for example, Luton South has 1,400 streets in, each with, say, 100 houses. So that's about nearly 140,000 households, right? So to get around to each and every single one, it is very, very challenging. So one of the things that we've devised is to try and look at our high target, high voter base, a high probability voter base, and then to try and address those accordingly. That doesn't mean that we don't care about the rest of the community. It just means in the short electoral cycle that we have, we need to be, we need to work a bit more smarter,
yeah,
and try and cover all of our bases. That's kind of what we've got to over there.
yeah.
And then we also have a lot of, demographic data, people's age ranges, and understanding, who's
Hmm.
under 35, matching them up with, the target electorate, understanding, how do we understand who votes for who, understanding postal votes, which is a very let's say it's a bit of a problematic area in many constituencies. So we need to understand how to address those kind of things. But it's all a learning experience because this is the first time
Yeah.
I've been involved in a campaign, as I think many other people have as well.
Mm.
So so we've got some stuff going on there. So
That was
yeah, so
the encouraging thing about when I spoke to Dr. Wajid Akhtar, and when we went to the town hall in Birmingham. They were
yeah,
saying that it's the start of a like a 25-year plan,
exactly,
to try and build kind of political literacy, activism,
yeah,
to get rid of the apathy,
yeah,
and kind of defeated kind of feelings and sentiments in the community, to actually go on and exert your right and exert your voice as a community. So it's a slow kind of process.
yeah.
Were there any
It's also, sorry, just to come on that, Salman, it's also about building up electoral capital as well for the future,
mm,
right? So what I mean by that is what we've noticed so far when you're actually on the ground is a lot of the established parties have a lot of electoral capital, which means they have a lot of data that's been gathered over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 election cycles.
yeah,
So they know, for example, where the over 70s are. They know, for example, where the postal votes are coming from. They know,
mm,
for example, where the propensity is to vote for Tory or for Labour or whatever. So they have all of those things that are mapped out over the last few election cycles. When you start as an independent, you don't have access to any of that stuff, right?
yeah.
So it becomes,
Unless you
you're almost
defected
trying
from
to,
Labour.
well, even if you've defected from Labour, we have a lot of
Yeah,
Labour defectors, right? But that kind of data is very well
yeah,
guarded, right? So you don't really have access to some of those
hmm,
real pinch points that can really influence how you do things. So for us, it's also about, when we're running these election cycles, it's not just about the success of the candidate, right? Where I've said, obviously, Dewsbury is a very high chance of
yeah,
success. Uh, Birmingham, Perry Bar is a very high chance of success. Luton South, Ilford North. So we can look at these that way, but we can also look at them with understanding, how do we build that electoral capital up for the future, right?
yeah,
How do we understand where our core voter base is, which way they voted, right? How do we understand how our demographics are changing, and how do we approach them?
yeah,
What kind of media do they respond to? What kind of media don't they respond to? So these are all things that are kind of built up over time, I say. And this short election cycle has actually given us a real opportunity to condense that and concentrate on that, to a great effect. So although the time has been short, and we've tried, everyone has tried their best, I'm sure, in all the constituencies up and down the country. People have made mistakes.
mm.
People have wished they would have done things a little bit differently here or there. But it's also allowed us to gather that data
It's
for
valuable
future
learning.
references. Yeah, exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
and
So
also
that's very,
just the kind of the I like that word. What did you call it? Electoral capital.
yeah,
There's also kind of the human capital as well, of volunteers, people knocking on doors,
exactly.
knowing the local businesses, help getting people to print flyers, and
Yeah,
where to put things up, and meetings
because
to have and stuff like that.
that's a very big challenge, as I was
Yeah,
expressing earlier. The canvassing part of it is a real big challenge, and it requires the most amount of effort. And the reason is because that has the most impact as well in terms of your voter base.
mm,
So there's the physical act of just dropping a leaflet through a letterbox, or just sending WhatsApp messages around to your groups, or social media around to different people. Now, some people react to that, the younger generation especially, but there's no real substitute for knocking on people's doors and having those conversations,
yeah,
whether it's 20 seconds or 40 minutes, like I was involved in the other day. It took up all of my time, right? But those conversations are very, very necessary to build that recognition, because people have this propensity to think that, well, I only have two choices, right? It's almost kind of ingrained within
yeah,
people, whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim. It's just, the Tory voters, one of the predetermining factors of them is that they'll switch to Labour. The reason they'll switch to Labour and not vote at all or stay at home is because they have this kind of uh, underlying civic duty that they must vote, irrespective whether they completely agree with somebody or not. They have to cast an X in a box somewhere. They don't not want to cast that X. So I think it's understanding that, and understanding that canvassing the recruitment of volunteers is a really
Yeah.
primary activity in some of these campaigns.
Mm.
And that's where we've had the most challenges, because people are not used to that. People are not used to knocking on people's doors and asking for their vote, or
Yeah.
asking them, how many people are registered, who have you voted for previously, and those kind of questions. It's just, we as a community haven't done that properly. It's only
Yeah.
the career activists and the career politicians really who have covered that
Yeah.
ground off before.
So
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah, it sounds like a very solid, good first step to build the grassroots, the
Yeah.
capacity, the electoral capital, the human capital,
Mm.
the data for future elections. Alhamdulillah. So you showed us Luton South, Dewsbury. Were there any constituencies where you looked at the stats and it was a bit surprising, or something you didn't?
Surprising is perhaps not the right word. I mean, the kind of things, the kind of concentration, because we're looking at concentrations, right? So we
Mm,
know that certain concentrations will actually perform well. So, for example, initially there was this thought that if the Labour majority is really big, that we don't really have a chance, right? So, for
mhm,
example, somewhere like Birmingham Ladywood, Shabana Mahmood's constituency, right? So initially it was felt that, well, actually that constituency is all sewn up because Shabana Mahmood has got inroads into the community. There are people who have canvassed for her previously. I think her father's a senior member of the community as well in Alum Rock and around Birmingham Centre, and that therefore there is no real challenge to that space, if you like, right? Despite the Muslim concentration being overwhelmingly, I think about 46% or something, right?
mm,
But it just requires a mindset change. So when you stand up a candidate, it almost kind of, changes that dynamic, overnight, because then what you have is you have a real choice then, right,
yeah,
between the old guard, which is continue to vote for Labour, or understand where someone new is coming in. Right now, people may agree or not agree with the candidate who's there, Yaqub Ahmed, right? But it's a real choice, right? It's a choice there that people can
yeah,
pursue, right? It's somebody that people can say, well, actually, that is a very real choice on a pro Gaza ticket, somebody who can express my views,
yeah,
it's a bit of a, sometimes people say that that candidate is a bit of a Marmite candidate, but still, I think that choice is really important, because in some ways, the candidate themselves are not the most important thing here. What's more important is the impact and the confidence it gives our community. I think,
yeah, yeah.
that's more important than whoever people choose the candidate to be, right? Because
Mm,
a vote for whoever it is not really a vote for that person. It's a vote for the sentiment, right? And that's what we understand. And hopefully, after this election cycle, we'll be in a position to say whether we win or lose in any of these constituencies, or whether we achieve great success or no success. I think that what will certainly be certain is the fact that, we have achieved this kind of flip, right? And we have achieved that, confidence trick, right?
yeah,
Whereby people before would have thought that, well, there is no other option. Yeah. There is no, we can't, foreseeably, we can't do this. We can't stand up candidates. We can't expect to get votes. We don't have the machinery in place. We don't have any sort of
yeah,
infrastructure in place. We can't manage this, to now where people are thinking, well, actually, it's not so difficult to do. It's within our grasp. Yeah. And
yeah,
I
yeah.
think that's perhaps the more important thing.
I think the local elections a month or two ago showed this as
Mm.
well. I remember reading that Labour, a Labour source, I think they mentioned on Sky that in electorates where the Muslim percent, the Muslim um, percentage was more than 20, Labour fell on average by 18 percentage points,
Yeah,
something like that.
exactly.
So,
Yeah, and I think that would probably be more exaggerated in the general election,
mm,
because in a local election the turnout is very low, right? It's only, I showed you figures of about 60 to 70% in a general election. In local elections, probably about 30-35%.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. You only
So
find the
the
cards when you're going through the takeaway menus and stuff like that.
yeah, exactly. So the thing is, in a general election, that
Mm,
hopefully that will be amplified, because what we're seeing in the doorstep is a definite swing away from Labour in the Muslim population.
yeah,
I don't think honestly, I've been campaigning for door knocking for the last couple of 2 or 3 weeks now, and I haven't come across a single person who has said that they staunchly want to keep their Labour vote.
Yeah.
People have said, we want to turn, but we don't know where to turn to. Or we've got this age-old problem within the Muslim community of division of, candidates, if you like, a Workers' Party candidate and an independent candidate. So there's some
Yeah.
confusion there, which we can't solve all the ills of the community in one in the space of a couple of
Yeah.
weeks. But no one has actually said that they're going to keep their Labour vote, especially
Yeah.
in this town.
SubhanAllah.
Anyway, so that's something fundamental.
Yeah. So in terms of people, right, looking at candidates, do you one thing that really might surprise some people is the fact that there could be a credible threat to Keir Starmer's seat. You have Andrew Feinstein, kind
Yeah.
of, kind of a kind of well-known anti-apartheid figure, staunchly kind of
Yeah.
pro-Palestinian and anti-Zionism. Do you think there's looking at from your data scientist hat? Do you think there's a possibility at all that they can actually get rid of Starmer?
Yeah, what I'll actually do is bring up that sheet because somebody asked me that question,
Okay.
and I did a sheet for
Cool.
Kings. I think it was Holborn, was it?
Holborn and King's Cross, or Holborn
Holborn.
and King St Pancras, I think.
So if you bear with me a minute, I'll try and bring that up for you. If I've got it here. Oh, here we go. Holborn election data analysis. And then I can show you. Oops, 1 second.
No problem.
Right, let me just share my screen regarding
Okay.
Holborn. So this is where I get a bit negative now, right? So this is Holborn and St Pancras. So this is Keir Starmer Street. So unfortunately, although Andrew Feinstein is a superb candidate, and I think the
Hmm.
people supporting him support are excellent, I think the chances of victory in this seat are slim. If I'm perfectly frank.
Hmm.
I think, and I may be wrong on this, I may be completely wrong on this, right? But I think the main thing to look at is this. So again, we've got a victory target here. I'll just highlight these cells of about 17,000 or 18,000 votes, right?
Hmm.
When I was expressing those Muslim votes before, these Muslim votes here, the actual Muslim electorate in that constituency is not that much. It's about 16% of the total electorate. Hence,
Yeah.
the ceiling of the Muslim vote is only about this figure here, which is about 6,700 votes, right? Which means, conversely, that in order to achieve victory, you need about 12,000 votes from the wider community, right?
Yeah.
And that's where the challenge lies for Andrew, right? So
Hmm.
Andrew can try and get that to some degree. How successful that will be is perhaps open to interpretation. But
Yeah.
I have a feeling that I certainly think he will do quite well. I'm not so sure that he's going to do enough to claim victory there.
Well, I mean, the
That's
the Muslim,
whatever.
I've heard from the Muslim community there. I do a circle in
Mm,
that constituency, and I know some of the brothers there, and they were
yeah,
saying he's got a lot of support from non-Muslims,
yeah,
but they're struggling to get Muslims, to get more involved
that's true.
with with
That's true.
with campaigning. So, I
Yeah,
mean, I think it's. I'm still quite positively surprised. I thought there would be. I didn't know that there were that many Muslims there. So you got about
yes,
7,000. Accounting for the kind of lower election turnout of 60 something percent. So there's still a significant chunk Muslims can, contribute and help out. And just notice you've got Labour, Tory, and Brexit. What was the thinking behind that? Because presumably,
so
maybe
that's
there's other, maybe
I'm not
someone who
sure.
voted Lib
Yeah,
Dem
I'm not
or
sure if that was a typo there. I'll have to double check that, but that's usually for the
okay,
Liberal Democrats, that column,
okay,
right? So I'm not 100% sure. I'll have
yeah,
to check my data before whether Holborn was Brexit or Lib Dems. But that's the
yeah.
third party basically in that role.
Are you also looking at just the people who didn't vote? Because I guess that would represent um, a gold mine of people who don't feel that they were served by the either mainstream parties. either of them in the past, that would be like um, a target for independence. No.
Yeah, sure. So this is where this is where I think Andrew can have some bearing, right? So
Mm,
whereby, you've got this vote here, which we've said in, in traditional, let's say, Muslim concentrated community, some of that vote is hard to win over, right? Or harder to win over.
yeah.
But in a place like Holborn and St Pancras, where there's a large progressive majority of people, both Muslim and non-Muslim, I think those votes are ripe for turnover, right?
Mm,
But how many you get with a quite a big labor machinery in that constituency is probably down to interpretation.
mm.
I would say you would get a fair few of that 11,000 that you need for victory. Whether you'd get
Because
all of that 11,000, I don't know.
there's also 30,000 people who didn't vote. If I read this correctly, if the turnout
How,
was 56,800 in 2019, and the
yeah.
total electorate is 86,000,
Hmm. Right. So the turnout
then
was 66%. Yeah.
yeah, so there's quite a chunk of people who,
I
um,
think what you would find, Salman, is that sometimes those turnout figures don't change that much over election
mm,
cycles because traditionally people who don't vote for whatever reason, you know, they just
yeah,
can't be bothered, they're not interested or whatever. Sometimes that turnout figure, if you look at the history of turnout figures over the last
yeah,
6, 7 election cycles, that doesn't actually vary that much, even with new
yeah.
turnout, right?
But I'm saying
Only when there's a
right now,
specific issue like
yeah,
Brexit or the Gaza issue, then sometimes it
yeah,
turns quite a bit.
yeah. Cause, no, because one just anecdotally, one a significant cause for people not voting is also the fact that there's no one that they want to vote for.
Mm,
They
true,
don't find they may be politically homeless, or they don't find
true,
anyone in Labour or the Conservative Party or Lib Dems even that
true.
they feel is worth voting. So if there is someone that comes along and ticks that box, that says something that people agree with, then it's like even more of a duty on them to turn out and kind of vote,
Yeah.
even if it's just to
No,
punish the mainstream parties, and like what we're doing in
and
this
because
country.
it's Keir Starmer's seat as well, I think that's extra motivation for people to turn out, right? It's extra.
Yeah,
If you didn't need any more motivation, yeah, right? It's Keir Starmer's seat, so that's extra motivation.
yeah,
And I think you couple that with the fact that Andrew is got such a rich history of activism, both in South Africa and over here,
yeah,
and he's a very capable candidate, and that makes it a lot more palatable to people, right?
yeah, yeah,
Especially amongst the non-Muslim, progressive community in
mm,
Holborn and St Pancras. So that could have a big bearing on things, right?
yeah,
However, I still think it's an uphill climb
yeah. Of course. I
in
mean,
particular.
but the way,
But yeah, even if you can turn that majority, what's the majority looking now? So it was 27,000 in 2019. If the polls hold, it was expected to be about 35,000. And if you have an independent candidate, it's going to be about 20 something. If you can get that majority shrinking, that in itself is a victory.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
so
yeah,
I think that bodes well. Let's see what happens.
yeah. I mean, I heard it was George Galloway said the other day on interview with Five Pillars with Dilly, was saying that you know um, it's normal actually in recent history. Perhaps we don't recall this in our country or in our
Mm,
kind of living memory, but he said it's very normal for and common for big parties to become small suddenly and small parties to become big. In many European kind of Western European nations, and
yeah,
even in Europe, British history as
yeah.
well. The
I mean,
history of
look what's happened with the Conservative Party,
yeah,
right? Over even just after the elections was announced. So, with all the betting scandals and everything else that's going on, it's been one disaster over another. So,
yeah,
to to be quite honest, we could have done with them doing a lot better, to help our cause,
yeah,
right? But they've just imploded beyond belief, right? So I don't know what kind of disaster they're looking at on July the 4th. But
mm,
in order to help our cause for independence, it would have helped if the Tory party would have been actually slightly better, right?
yeah,
But unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be the case, and they're probably going to implode in a big way.
And they're
Somewhere along the
leaking
line.
to reform as well.
Or they're leaking to reform. They've got scandal after scandal.
Yeah,
Um, Labour really haven't really, done anything to deserve the victory, and they're going to walk away with a massive
yeah,
majority,
yeah, yeah,
which in the short term doesn't bode well for us. But in the long term, if you look at, when we were talking about future electoral cycles, if you think about our potential to have a block of about 15 to 20 votes, right? So 15 to 20 seats, if you like,
yeah,
in Parliament. If each one of these potential ones, bears some sort of fruit or comes to some sort of fruition and success, then literally when you've got a close contest between the two political parties, then you've got a lot of leverage in terms of policy
mm,
making, influence of decisions, what to do, what not to do, and that's where you have the real, real power in moving
yeah,
forward, right? And that's where the real substance comes in. At the moment, with a big Labour majority, we may not have that same sort of influence at the moment. But just to get people into the House of Commons, and they don't even have to do anything. Like Liane Mohammed, she just has to win and sit on the seats. Really, Liane is a very capable young lady, right? And she's very strong, and she's politically very sharp. Um, but even if she wasn't, and even if she just sat on those common seats, just the sight or the visuals of her being there is a big difference for
yeah.
us, I think, moving forward.
And that
So
spectacle of just punishing the Labour Party, punishing the mainstream parties, using
yeah,
Gaza, um, or because of Gaza, that sends a message as well, even for the internal politics within the Labour Party. They can, the people
exactly.
that didn't leave, weren't kicked out yet, they can use
Yeah,
that as, as a leverage to try and exert pressure, or even
yeah,
get rid of the Blairites one day. Who knows? But either way, I mean, we still have a duty to try our best to,
exactly.
join the good
But
and forbid the evil.
one thing I wouldn't want to go back to is to say, "Oh, look, we took a lot of votes for you, so give us some breadcrumbs from the table, and we'll join back with you again." Right? So
Yeah,
that's not really the intention that we should go in with, right? Because that would be a real, a real disaster for us. I
yeah,
think, if we went down that route. I think the way to look at it is to say we've created enough pressure, because I think previously people thought that the way to create pressure or the way to create influence, I think somebody said it at one of those town halls, is that you shouldn't confuse engagement with impact,
influence.
yeah, or with influence.
Yeah,
Now the thing is, and that's what something that we've got to be very careful about, because
mm,
just because you're engaged with them, and they'll come, after these election cycles are over, when we've taken, let's say, 7, 8, 9,000 votes or whatever in some of these constituencies of Labour, they'll come back to us and they'll say, "Well, we understand your concerns. We're listening now. We're in listening mode. We're doing this. We're doing that." And we shouldn't really confuse that with anything else. We need to understand, we need to have the confidence
mm,
to say that we need to stand up on our 2 feet. We've got that influence, because the only language they understand is the language of taking votes off them, right?
yeah,
There is no other language that is applicable. There is no other currency in politics, really, in the current framework. Not to say I
mm,
agree with everything in this framework, which I don't, but there is no currency other than that to do that, to do it that
yeah.
way.
It's interesting if
And
we
that,
start thinking about, what next, because
mm,
there's lots of arguments for and against different strategies. I mean, me personally, I'm not too sold on the idea of having a uniform block vote. Um,
mm,
I mean, I think it needs to be there as a kind of threat, but in terms of in like future, talking about maybe many election cycles ahead, I think I'm warm to the idea of these, just giving our demands out there, and having people, having candidates fight for your vote, saying, "Look,
yeah,
here are our 10 demands. How many do you agree to? How many do you agree to? How many do you agree to?" There you have it.
yeah,
The choice is, is clear from that perspective, and to try and get all parties to try and to compete for your vote and compete for your support, rather than just throw your weight behind one candidate or one party or something like that. Just leave it open on a kind of local basis. I think there's a lot of merit in that. But there also has to be that threat on a national level that, look, these Muslims, they have 10,
yeah,
20, 30, 100, whatever, how many seats that they could influence. We need to at
Yeah.
least stay within, a certain boundary of respect for them, not treating them with contempt, which Labour has been doing, but having a healthy level of respect, and uh, uh, you know, doing something to deserve your support. But I mean,
Yeah.
another idea some people have floated is even a Muslim party. What are your thoughts on that? I noticed that
Well,
the
I
acronym for the United Kingdom Islamic Party is available now.
it's probably taken, right? Along the line. I can't imagine what that would be. Um, I think with the Muslim Party, there are various pros and cons to doing that.
Mm,
I think we're perhaps not at that stage yet. I mean, let's see what happens after this election cycle, and let's see where we kind of get to, and maybe after the next election cycle as well, to understand how much leverage we
yeah.
have, how
Mm,
much commonality we have. Because as you know, one of the prime one of the prime reasons for angst in this election cycle has been the multiplicity of candidates standing up in each seat, on the same issue,
yeah.
on the house
Mm,
issue. So I can't remember where it was. I think it's Birmingham Hall Green, where you've got three independent candidates, or maybe even four independent candidates standing. Right. So that is certainly not healthy, and that's a result of some age old grievances and politics within our
yeah.
community that's
Mm,
happened over time, and that unfortunately can't be sorted out in a few weeks. Although a lot of attempts have been made to do that. Um, so I think those kind of things, those learnings or those challenges that we faced in this short space of
yeah.
time
Mm,
have to be addressed somehow. We need to understand how we move forward with this now and on a common basis, on common platforms. That doesn't mean that everybody has to agree with everything. It's not a dictator, it's not an autocracy, but we have to understand what are the fundamental limits. We have to understand the power of having one candidate per constituency, especially in very, very important constituencies like Hall Green or Yardley or places like that, whereby those are very, very winnable seats. So we need to understand the importance
yeah.
of doing that
Yeah.
for the future. But just coming again to this issue of party, because I think people underestimate how much leverage we can have here. Because when I speak to some of my American colleagues and the abandoned Biden campaign and what's happening there, so some of that is very they don't like me for saying this, but some of that is very frothy in terms of the way they're structured, or not the way they're structured rather, but the influence that they can have, because the concentration of Muslims are just not there in the United States. I mean, the place with the highest concentration is Michigan, or Dearborn, Michigan, near
Mm,
Detroit, right?
mm,
And if I was presenting these figures to you now, where you've got Luton 29%, some places in Birmingham which are 46%, Dewsbury, some was of similar figures of above 40%. If you look at Michigan, what would you estimate the Muslim concentration to be in Michigan?
much lower, I'm imagining.
It's about 5% at most.
Wow.
So, one of our criteria for understanding which seats to go for has been that the Muslim concentration has to be at least above, let's say, 20%, or if not above 18% or something, right? So we wouldn't even, if Michigan was here as a
Yeah.
seat, we wouldn't even look at Michigan,
I think
because
it's a different universe over there. When I
exactly,
speak to people over there, it's more, and the Muslims can still have an impact, but it's via basically having a
other
public
means.
affairs committee and putting money
Yeah,
into the system,
exactly.
and candidates and stuff. Because every candidate's for sale pretty much over there.
Yeah,
Muslims
exactly.
have money there, alhamdulillah, so
Yeah.
why not?
So a lot of Muslims are very excited in the States
Mm,
about doing this through the electoral cycles, but I really don't think uh, it's as great an opportunity as we have here. We have a fantastic opportunity. It's just that people don't
yeah,
realize it.
yeah,
Once we start to realize our own power here, then it can make a big difference.
subhanallah.
Whether it's through a Muslim party moving forward, or a collective of some sorts, or some sort of allegiance on certain fundamental points, that can also happen. So there's various methods about doing that moving forward, I think, which is
Yeah.
unfortunately not the case in other places. You know.
Excellent. So, in terms of looking at that Muslim power now, just to wrap up, you mentioned that there's about 20 constituencies where there's a huge, potential
Mm.
power for Muslims to make a difference. But beyond that, if we go beyond those 20, the Muslim Vote website, for example, has what, like 100 odd things on their thing of who to vote for, on the page of who to vote for. So the Muslims can still make a significant impact if we're, if we're coordinated and if we carry out our just our Islamic duty of just being active in our local communities and trying and enjoying good and forbid evil where we can. So can you just briefly show us how to use this section of the website of of the
Yeah, sure.
muslimvote.co.uk and the section of who to vote for?
Yeah, sure. I'll just take you through that. So these are the endorsements, if you like, from the Muslim World. Now, I mean, Muslim World, as you know, is a loose organization. It's not really, these are just the general
Yeah.
endorsements of some of these constituencies. So the way you can look at it is some of the core constituencies which we've been talking about. For example, Blackburn is a very high chance of probability of victory. Unfortunately, you have a complication with candidates there. So
Yeah.
this is the recommendation from the Muslim vote for that particular seat, and that's the sitting MP there, Kate Holland, right? And Adnan
Hmm.
Hussain is the actual recommendation there. So this is how you need to look at it: is vote for is the column that you need to look for, which is what the endorsement are and what the recommended vote is from this point of view, and who the current MP is, right? And then it talks about the majority that was there in 2019 and how much impact that you can potentially have, and
Hmm.
whether they voted for the ceasefire. So now this column was true in, I think the ceasefire vote was held in November, was it last year,
Yeah.
somewhere around that time. So this actual table was constructed then, and that vote, whether they're in favor or they're against, is an indication, but it's not the only indication that you should look at. So, for example, in Luton South, both of our MPs actually resigned and they voted for the ceasefire, but the community has
Hmm.
still decided to stand up candidates against them, right?
Okay.
Primarily because they feel that the association with Labour is too strong, and they were only forced into making those statements, right? So you've got to look at the nuances behind
Mhm.
why people voted there as
So
well.
this is these the vote for column is basically is it's come from the local communities.
That's right. Yes, a lot of it's come from the local communities.
Mhm.
I don't know the details about every single one of these recommendations, but I think there was some sort of multiplicity in candidates where people have actually resolved which candidate to go for. So, for example, you've got Ajmal Masroor in Bethnal Green and Stepney, and
Yeah.
I know there was a deep conversation about how to choose that candidate there. You've got, as I spoke to you about before, Adnan Hussain in Birmingham. You've got uh, where else is Andrew Feinstein, we've been talking about
Mm.
in Keir Starmer's seat. Oh, there's my favourite candidate, Atiq Malik here for Luton South, right? So
Mashallah. Rap, rap, rap.
Asabi there, yeah. Strangely enough, Luton North is not on here, which I need to talk to them about, which
Slavs
needs to
there.
be updated on.
Mashallah.
Yeah, so it's a guy called Tawkir Shah, right? Birmingham Perry Bar, Ayub Khan, Slough is a very interesting one with Azhar
Yeah. I
Chauhan.
interviewed our candidate last
So
week on
Azhar,
the podcast. Azhar
yeah,
Chauhan, yeah.
yeah. So Azhar is actually against Tan Desi, right? Now Tan
Yeah.
actually abstained from the ceasefire, despite the fact that there is a substantial Muslim majority in that
Yeah.
town. So yeah, so there's a range of people on here. Some people, I am of the opinion, and this is my personal opinion, I am of the opinion that independent candidates should really be endorsed, right? And should really be the ones carrying the flag.
Mhm.
I have some sort of reservations about, making endorsements for people from other parties. For example, the Workers' Party, and I know the Workers' Party is a double-edged sword, but sometimes they cause a lot of confusion and a lot of, uh, you know, there's a lot of position dynamics with the Workers' Party that's not always favourable to what we're trying
Mm.
to do as a project. So, for example, even in the Luton constituencies or in the Slough constituencies, the Workers' Party candidate has not actually stood down in favour of the independent, and
Yeah.
that's a real shame because that actually confuses the electorate to some degree.
Yeah.
Even George Galloway, asserted that if there is a credible candidate, the Workers' Party candidate would stand down. So there's a lot of those things that need to be ironed out. Um, and yeah, so I would always favour the independent candidate over
Mhm.
anybody else. That's the way I would look at this.
Inshallah. So if somebody's watching, they want to find out their constituency, how do they go about such? So just go to this page and scroll down
Yeah,
until they
so they
find
just
it,
go
or
to this page,
is there a search?
themuslimvote.co.uk, do a search. It's on the front. It's on the first page anyway.
Okay.
You would just search through there, and then you would just look at who to vote for, who not to vote for,
Yeah. Mm.
and whether you agree with that, and then check it up yourself. Do some research yourself in terms of finding out who are the other candidates that are standing, whether you have a choice between a pro Gaza ticket, between the Workers' Party, independent candidates, and other people.
Hmm.
Me personally, I would always favor an independent candidate over somebody else associated with George Galloway's agenda or anybody else's agenda. That's the way I would look at things. But yeah, certainly this is a guide, I would say, in terms of
Okay.
moving forward.
Jazakumullah khair, bro. Just have a quick fire few questions that we do with every guest on our Empowered podcast.
You
Um,
didn't prepare me for this, right? So
yeah,
it's just
no,
a
this
bit
is
unknown, right?
this is
Yeah,
off the cuff, but yeah, just first kind of answer that pops in your head. Yeah, name a recent book or audiobook that you would recommend. Doesn't have to be about the topic; could be anything that pops in your
it
head.
doesn't have to be about it. It's going to be an economics book, right?
Yeah.
End of History and the Last Man by Francis Fukuyama.
Okay. Nice.
I yeah, it's not agreeable with my point of view, but it's a brilliant book to read
Mm.
from an
End of
opposing view.
history.
Yeah,
MashaAllah. Which gadget other than your phone do you value the most?
right. This is going to sound really middle class now, right? My golf clubs,
Your
which is going
golf
to be
club.
really weird. Yeah, it's just going to be really weird.
They're gadgets.
Living in Luton, there's a Muslim golfing association out there for
Yeah,
anybody who wants to know about it. Yeah.
mashallah. My friend's part of that. Dawood, shout
Okay.
out
Yeah.
Dawood. Dawood
Yeah.
Khan from Northwood. Which website or app would you encourage others to visit or download? I think this is a clear one.
Evernote. I love Evernote.
Okay. I thought you were going to say the
That's
Muslim
note
vote
taking. Yeah.
UK.
Yeah.
Evernote. Okay, I've heard good things about that. And finish this sentence. If our audience would remember only one thing from this podcast, it would be
Vote independent.
very independent. Very simple, clear message. Punish Labour, punish Tories, vote independent.
Atiq Malik in Luton South. There's
I
another
think,
one. Dr. Yusha in Luton
mashallah,
North. Yeah.
mashallah.
Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. All right, Jazakumullah khaira. Riaz
Jazakallah.
Hassan, thanks for
Yeah.
joining us. And thanks for joining at home. If you like this podcast, give it a like and a share. Remember to click subscribe wherever you're finding these podcasts. This one was a bit of um, a visuals heavy one. So if you were listening, feel free to come and check out the video versions on YouTube to check out the nice spreadsheets that Riaz was showing us. And that's it from me. Until next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.